Jason, excited to have you on today. There's a lot of areas we want to explore. As we were talking about before recording, I think it's a very fascinating time right now in crypto. We've gone through a few, let's say, crypto winters. I'm not sure if it's the right term. I'd love for someone that's been in the space for so long, maybe to unpack a little bit and give us a state of crypto today. Where are we? What are the main trends? What's on your radar?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks, Nectar, for having me on. I was looking forward to this conversation. Off air, we often have these chats, but to 60,000 feet. If you, the short answer is when you look at the space broadly speaking. I think we're in a moment where a lot of the backbone has been built. And when I say backbone, I mean like the infrastructure level. And um, in the past few years, for the past like 5 to 7 years, I think only recently it's gotten to a moment where it's very user experience driven. But prior to, let's say, about 12 to 24 months ago, when you wanted to do anything on the blockchain, you essentially had to interact directly with the infrastructure. Um, so when you ask these big questions, how are we meant to onboard all these people, and how are we meant to have this technology adopted in a mainstream format? Um, you have to build what is called sort of the application layer, and that application layer, I think this is what's driving me. But generally speaking, I think this is where most of the innovation will happen. In terms of at scale and in terms of quantity and diversity. It's the layer where people interact with the blockchain at different types of in different types of scenarios. So I think this is a very critical moment, not in terms of, because generally speaking, I think the blockchain has proven itself. Bitcoin has been the technology itself. It's been very, very stable, very successful. If you look at all those decentralized finance infrastructure, when you look at Uniswap, those decentralized exchange, they've been very, very stable, very efficient. So all of these elements, I think, are doing really well. Now we have to figure out how can we leverage this infrastructure, and make it, or at least leverage it in a way that solves things. Now, what are those things that you want to solve? There's a lot of things to be solved, but yeah, that's the question. How do we leverage this technology now, this infrastructure, to make things better? And whatever, again, it's subjective. What is better for someone? What's better for someone else? But yeah, that's my
Yeah,
answer.
maybe I could start unpacking a bit. And I was saying before recording, like you're gonna have to talk to me as if I'm five. Like I
Yeah.
grew up in the Web one world. I'm like I understand AOL and Netscape,
Oh
but
man, I've been through it. I got my CD in the mail, man. I know.
so it's like all jokes aside, it's like I think we all talk about like Web one, Web two, now Web three. I see Web three as the opportunity for people to participate and have actual skin in the game. So the ownership part is what's been lacking, right? So everyone for Web two is basically brought the world online, but it's all centralized gatekeepers, and I use that word purposefully versus Web3 where people can participate and own a part of it. So it's like the I'd like to hear you maybe the ultimate kind of use case why there's been so much appeal. Is it really because of that? Is it like a little bit of the rebel rage against machine, like hey, we want to like take back power, or do you see it differently as like the appeal for smart entrepreneurs like yourself in the space?
Yeah, I think it's a very tricky question. Not everyone sees the blockchain in the same way, like its main value proposition. So I think, how can I say? A lot of people will say, blockchain is about anonymity. A lot of people will say that the blockchain is about, immutability. A lot of people will say that the blockchain is about trustless transactions and processes and things of the such. And obviously there's, the fact that you just raised, that a lot of people will see the blockchain as something that is about ownership. It's really about owning something. I think all of these are quite valid. It depends in which area, or at least which of these important differentiating feature you want to leverage. And in my case, what I find truly fascinating with the blockchain is it's not necessarily ownership. I mean, ownership, yes, but I think you can get ownership in very different, various format. But for me, I think it's more the trustless and really the immutability. Definitely not the anonymity. But when you convert and you leverage these two things that I just mentioned, that really I'm passionate about, I think that the byproduct of this is speed. And um, when you start diving into the startup world and you think about launching something, going from an idea and then into something that is in market, timing is often, your worst enemy. And, it's all about speed. And I think the blockchain is, it's definitely something that, in my opinion, solves this sort of, not necessarily a problem, but it improves the process by an order of magnitude, like by a lot. So yeah, we can dive into that deeper later, but I think that for me, this is what it is.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. It goes back. We're harkening back to that. The Web 2 era. It's like I started my career, 03, 04, and then you kind of saw the growth. There's this like really exciting groundswell of like anything is possible. And to your point of like, oh, use cases. What are the use cases today? It's like no one could have predicted. Let's say when the iPhone came out, that you were going to use it as your personal taxi service, right? Like 5 years later, right? So it's like there's a good argument.
Yeah.
It's like the use cases are less important when there is a technological breakthrough of this sort. But I think therein lies the challenge for a company where the cash flows are far away, right? So how do you think about that? Like, hey, we need to pay people in real world money, and they can't just eat tokens. They need a salary, and then making making actual revenues and profits now in the state where it's a tough time right now, so like for the markets for raising funds. So how do you balance the short term and the long term is what I'm curious about.
Yeah, this is the $1 million question. And like the answer I have for this is, a lot of people go into sort of Web3, DeFi, or any of those realm in the blockchain, especially the token based projects. And I can only speak for my use case, which you know we launched our own token, and we have this type of currency behind what we do, and we give it utility and everything. But ultimately, when I got into this, having been on the opposite side, as an end user and a consumer and a holder, and etc., uh, I've been able to see and to experience firsthand that there is extreme volatility in the space. And I could only imagine, like trying to run a business that relies on this or whichever asset to operate on. And going into this, I said, well, I have to create, or at least I need to come up with a business model that is not reliant on market behavior. I can't have all my eggs in one basket. I need to diversify. I need to have some traditional type of revenue model in the mix, um, so I can at least have that. And to your point, yes, of course, people absolutely cannot live just on tokens. And there needs to be, and even beyond that, even if they did live on tokens, the hard part is still, we're still at a state where, and I'm going to use fancy words here, but on ramping and off ramping, which is the process of taking another fancy word, fiat, which is your normal tender, and whether it's USD, Canadian, Australian, whatever, and you want to take it, and they call it on ramp because you bring it into the crypto world for whatever digital currency you want to hold in exchange for your hard earned dollars. Like, all of that is still very much centralized, and this process has to go through these exchanges, and there's a lot of steps, and it's complicated, but most of it is very much not only centralized but focused around what we call layer one protocols, or blockchains, or anything like that. And that's your typical 100 100 coins, and from Bitcoin to Solana to Cardano. A lot of these are very well known publicly, but most of the projects and the innovation, in my opinion, in terms of entrepreneurship, is happening on layer two. And layer two is sort of what you stack on top of a layer one. So it uses the basis infrastructure, but most of the time, layer twos are about speed and about different types of features and benefits. But all this to say that you're starting to be quite far in the space. So if someone gives you, as a form of compensation, a token that lives on a second layer of a first layer protocol or blockchain, now taking it out of there into money, or at least a form of currency that you can use to buy your grocery and pay your rent, very complex. So there's a lot of moving parts in there that are not necessarily totally figured out, or at least efficient, for these options to be sustainable. And plus, you need to add the volatility in there. One day I give you something that could be worth like $1,000 in terms of compensation, but if you don't do anything with it and it's not a stable asset, then the next day, yes, you can gamble with it and it could be worth more, or it could be worth less. So you have to be careful and mindful of that.
Maybe to ask again a rookie question, and so I might be off in the framing of it. So it's like I think you explained it well. There's layer one, which are like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and then there's layer two, which is, let's say, like the Lightning network that would allow, let's say, Bitcoin, which has obviously well known constraints. It would allow it to operate much more efficiently. How do you see bringing new cryptocurrencies to market versus, let's say, the transformation of, like we called, fiat, right? So what do you see as a more I'm thinking of the word in French, envisageable, or likely future? Is it the Canadian government or US government taking their dollar, creating a digital currency that's immutable, etc., that lives on a blockchain? Or do you see that supplanted by Bitcoin, that becomes a new standard, like a lot of Bitcoin maxis would say? Am I even wrong in like the framing of this question, or do these two will just coexist forever like they are today?
It's a trick question in the sense that no, personally, I think nobody knows what's going to happen. I often have this sort of theory around currencies and what it's going to become. And I think we need to, or at least my opinion, is we need to see sort of um, crypto in a new way that is not necessarily um, dependent or needs to fit in a certain mold that has been ingrained in our mind for however long currencies have existed in our physical world. So if you take that out of sort of the defining environment for crypto, um, I think a lot, and this might sound foreign, but that's the kind of thing that gets me excited. But um, I like to see blockchains in terms of um, cultures. And you mentioned, Bitcoin and the maximalists around this their ethos and what they believe and all. So sometimes I see these as almost countries, and in these countries, they have their own currency and they have their own vision, they have their own um, values, and they see things in specific ways. And then you have this other blockchain, let's say Bitcoin, and you have Solana, and you have ETH, and all of them have their own communities and they have their own ways of seeing what the future will become and how their own economy will interact and be somewhat an important part of that future. And then now you have to figure out, like, how do these entities, and if you consider them almost like countries, like, how do you move money across these countries and how do you get these different countries to interact with each other? And a lot of them will be infrastructures, a lot of them will be something more about transactional layers, a lot of them will be about application layers. But I think the short answer to your question is not necessarily like, is Canada going to adopt, a certain specific currency? I think we need to potentially see this new thing as being something totally different, and having currencies that will have specific features and benefits. Sometimes when I look at my phone and I sort of look at my sort of Apple wallet, I'm thinking, in terms of, let's say, if I live in a world of crypto and I'm seeing, this is Bitcoin, this is ETH, this is whatever. But if I'm using one of them versus another, then I'm participating in something beyond just the currency. I'm supporting something, or um, it becomes value driven rather than just currency driven. And I think this is something that people underestimate, um, and is an intangible, but is truly something extremely powerful in crypto. It's sort of these elements in those communities. And again, the word community, a lot of people will mention over and over and over again that Web3 is all about community. But that, again, that's another topic. But
Well, it's funny you
that's
mentioned
my
because
weird answer for your question.
it's not weird at all. It's funny because one of the questions I had was actually community, right? So I have it labeled here. It's like the importance of communities that overused, but it seems table stakes. I think in every crypto project. And you mentioned like we talked about like poking at the the Bitcoin maximalists, but it's like there is a very heavy component of almost religious fervor to not just Bitcoin but almost every project. So like maybe we could start diving and going a little bit deeper into Embr a little bit. So like I'd be curious to hear you talk about your community, how you think about it, because it's not just you and your team. Like you have built an actual community. So like I wanted to unpack and understand how your philosophy around it.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun that you ask, because, and I'm not sure how the other sort of, I have, no, if someone says they're an expert or anything like that. And in space such as Web3 or crypto or anything like that, there's no such thing as an expert. But I have a limited experience. But what I can say, regarding our own sort of experience in there is Embr is a very unique project in the sense that we sort of all came up in another community, and we sort of connected around another project, and we got together and we started thinking about problems and all those sorts of things, and then we tried something and didn't work, and then we decided to kickstart something else, and a lot of people decided to follow, and they were like, these guys, they have this idea, and I think this, you know it's very strong how much an idea can bring people together. It's very old school, and but we had this idea of, and again, you have to come from the perspective of the problem, because every idea is trying to solve something in the space, and in our case, what we had identified at its most sort of simplest form is really going from the moment of ideation, and in your traditional startup space is, and I wasn't there, but last week you had Startup Fest, obviously, in Montreal, and it's very much about these ideas and these people that are launching something, and they want to get noticed and etc. And then you go from ideation to launch, and you have all these different steps. But doing something that is so blueprinted in Web 2, like, the book has been written. Like, it's like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, and it's a given. But in Web 3, there is no book. Like, there is absolutely no book. And for me, coming from a place where I was very much involved in entrepreneurship in the Montreal ecosystem, it fascinated, it truly fascinated me to see so many people trying to create or bring innovation without a blueprint. It's like, how do you figure it out? Like, even me as a seasoned entrepreneur, I've been starting businesses since I was like 16 years old. I know how all of these things work. I know how, like, I know all those steps, and but in crypto, like, everything you thought you knew, just throw it out the window. Nothing applies. Like, in terms of doing things, you have to figure it out every day. And every time you think you've figured it out, there's either a premium on that. Like, what I mean by premium is that every service provider will charge you an extra to deal with crypto because of the liability, or they'll just blatantly say no, they'll not work with you. So it's very, very complicated. And what we wanted to do with Embr is that, through our sort of experience of going from ideation to launch, we thought to ourselves, well, wouldn't it be great if we went out there and everything we did was the blueprint, and that we would take notes and every step of the way, and obviously we don't have all the answers, but we'd identify the pitfalls, we every single thing, and we would map out this journey, not only in terms of the experience, but also in terms of the tech needed, flawless, seamless tech that is grouped in some form of I don't like to use the word like one-stop shop, but like this platform approach where you're quite used to seeing it in Web 2, but in Web 3, as I said very much early in our conversation, Nectar, we're still at the infrastructure level. And what this means is every time you want to do something, um, it's either to the left or it's either to the right, and these things, they don't talk to each other, and it's like the whole thing is a mess. It's complicated. And and again, off air, I was saying, sometimes I would just love to be able to call someone of these providers and vendors in Web3 and just talk it out, and like, I want to do this, and like, is this something you can help me with? And if not, can you recommend me to someone else? But you can't even do that. It's like Telegram here, everybody's anonymous. You have avatars and profile pictures, and people have Wild West names. And it's like, where am I? What the hell is this? I just want to start a business. Like, how am I supposed to do it? So, so funny enough, we ate our own dog food, and that's an old expression, but we created all the tools that were needed to launch a token-based project. So what this means is, in the world of blockchain and crypto and Web3, this means that you have to build smart contracts. And those smart contracts, it's the whole like trustless and immutable side of things. And not a lot of people, because there are things out there that are called launch pads, but these launch pads, they're like big marketplaces. They're like eBays of projects, and there's no curation really. It's a lot of different things. You have the ill-intended with the well-intended, and like, how do you position yourself in there, and a lot of the moving parts to launching a project like these launch pads. When you sort of, prior to the launch pad, there's nothing, but to get to the launch pad, you need to go through so many steps, again, that there's no book to it. But in our case, sort of, we developed everything that we needed to. And when I say launch something, this means in DeFi terms, it's called an initial Dex offering. And that means that you're basically pricing your business even before you have a product on the secondary market. And when I mean secondary market, it's basically, it's a funny world, because if you look at your traditional startup stages of funding, you normally go seed, series A, et cetera, and then eventually you IPO. And that means that you go to the sort of the public markets, and then people can buy shares of your business, and that's how you capitalize and how you raise, by emitting new shares, et cetera. But in DeFi, you actually start with that prior to even having a product. Most people will go and raise capital without even having a product. So for us, essentially, we build the tools to do this, but in a Web 2 sort of approach, meaning that instead of having, like, sending our community to these marketplace, these sort of launch pads, we did our sort of IDO on our own website with our own tools, with our own smart contracts. And this offering is something that does not exist in Web3, um, but is something that is so natural when you think about it, that everything that people do in Web3 sometimes is it's because it's this big echo chamber. People get used to the difficulties, and then they see those difficulties, or these dysfunctional ways of doing things, as normalities. But when you have this objective view on these processes, you're like it's totally mental, like absolutely mental. So Embr is, and I explained it more and I think this is the advantage of podcasts, is that you can go into details about, how it actually works and what's the point and all those sorts of things. But essentially, Embr is really about um, helping people with the know-how and the tools needed to launch their project in Web3. And we can break all this apart with different products and services, but bottom line, that's what it is.
Yeah, yeah, you're helping people build, the tools and the picks and shovels, as they say. And I think one point you raised, I think more maybe a little more esoteric about the attraction of people in the space. And like you said, it's hard, it's difficult, but all this, like a lot of smart people going into it. It made me think of like Ernest Shackleton and his trip to Antarctica, right? Like, you remember that famous ad, like men wanted for hazardous journey, low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete
Yeah, I
darkness,
remember that. Yeah,
safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in event of success.
guaranteed.
And it's like, well, people flock to that much more than, like safe perks and like climbing walls and like free lunches. And it's like, smart people are attracted to difficult things to do. And it's like, I think in your particular case with Embr, like, and I'd love to unpack a little bit what you're doing is like building the railroad to a certain extent to allow other companies. And like I said, you don't know which companies are going to flourish or not, right?
No.
But there will be successes along the way, right? So maybe to unpack a little bit Embr, the business model, its vision as to how you see it, and the main service you provide for
Yeah.
Web3 projects to launch.
Yeah. So the way we decided to break it apart and bring this in an efficient way to market is, so where we currently focus is what we would call, because we've segmented this ideation to launch into sort of four stages. One of them would be discovery, and that's where you have the idea, and we can help people discover your idea. So it's sort of this marketplace approach where you have all these ideas and it makes it easy for you to expose it and people to find you. And you can start building your community around this idea that's solving XYZ problem. And then you have the pre-launch, which is, you start converting these people into supporters and potentially investors in your project. And then the launch, this is where you take your business, what we call secondary market. So this is sort of the public offering of a token-based project. That's where people can now go to decentralized exchange. You've created a liquidity pool with automated market making, and people can buy your token on decentralized exchange. And then once this is done, then you have the challenge, and this is post launch and what we could call the operational phase of your business. It's the day to day, and this token, this asset, it's quite a big challenge to make it easily purchasable. And what I mean by this is, the problem that we had is when we launched our own token, uh, people had to go to a decentralized exchange to buy it. But I'm not going to go too much into the details of how complex it is to buy a token on a Dex. That's the short of decentralized exchange. But all this to say that there's about 20 steps. It takes an account here, an account there. It takes a wallet. It takes there's so many moving parts. And the friction is so high that it's almost crazy to think that so many people go through this process. Because if it be your traditional e-commerce business, it'd be 100% dropout, pretty much. And even worse is most people will discover your project and they'll go on your website, and then you explain what's your vision, your mission, and then you explain what's going to be your product and how is it going to solve the problem and all those sorts of things. And then when people are sort of, wow, I'd like to back this idea, just like if you were on Kickstarter, you're browsing and you're like, wow, I want to back this, I'm excited. Well, how do you go about it? Well, generally speaking, 9 out of 10 projects, what they'll give to you is like this string of characters and numbers that you need to copy and paste and basically go to a decentralized exchange, copy it in something that's called a swap, which again, jargon that most people don't know. That string of numbers is called a contract address, which basically it's the contract address of your smart contract, of your token. So it's like this mountain of things you need to know before you can even understand that when you want to go from discovery to action and get invested, it's just like almost impossible. So the first thing we brought to market is something that is pretty much the most basic thing. It's called Embr Checkout, and we've developed our own smart router that interacts with these decentralized exchange and creates and provides a better user experience for these people that want to go from discovery to action. And this checkout process, project leaders, they can put them on their website in 3 different formats, either as an embed, as a widget. They can also put it as a modal. So it's just like a buy button. You click on it, there's a little window that appears, and essentially you're guided through that flow as if you were 5 years old. Because that's how old people are regarding Web3. They just don't know anything. And the reality is, and I think this is the most important point, is you know, people don't need to know how it works. It doesn't matter. People don't need to know how decentralized finance work. I mean, at the end of the day, do you really know, Nectar, how centralized finance works? Do you really care how it works? No, you just want it to work. Like how the sausage is made, nobody wants to know, right?
I
So
just want my McFlurry with my tap on my Visa. So-
exactly. When you just want it to work, the pitch is simple. You tap your card, you get the McFlurry, right? You don't need to know that it's no, it's this whole promise of future settlement and the merchant and the fees and the credit system and this whole mountain of things. Um, you don't need to know that. So it's the same thing with Embr Checkout. We've designed it in a way where people, they don't need to know how it works. It just works.
Yeah, I love the concept. First of all, like amazing to hear you speak about what you guys are building. Like, I feel like it's a mix of like Stripe, obviously, is the kind of like the first idea, but also a little bit of AWS, where you're able to plug in different elements to allow a startup to basically be able to scale and build. Right. So it's like it sounds like you have a really broad vision. Curious to hear you about that vision as to like how early are, because it sounds to me like we're the early adopters of the early adopters, right? So it's still so early. How big do you think your particular, let's say, addressable market will be? Is it even a question that's relevant today, considering we're like kind of in the first inning? So yeah, just thinking about growth, where you're at today, maybe a little bit of stats as to how big the current Ember is.
Yeah, good question. So right now, in terms of, and I'll answer in reverse. I'll end with the potential of it, and I'll start with where we're at. So Ember, we released Checkout a few months ago in a private beta, and we're working right now with about almost 70 projects, and we're yesterday was one of our biggest days in terms of transaction volume. Week over week, it's just growing exponentially. We onboarded 10 new projects that we didn't even, outreach to, because initially it was cold calling. The cold start, everybody knows how, you can't build it and just expect they'll come. You have to go and get them. But now it's, the last 10 is word to mouth, and we're starting to see the snowball effect. And just in one day, we processed almost 160K USD in transaction, just in private beta, no marketing. And our goal is to get out of private and go into an open beta in the next 2 to 3 weeks at the most. So end of July, start of August, with multiple new features. Because right now, checkout only works with native currencies, meaning you need to have sort of that layer 2 digital asset to get that sort of token on that L2 blockchain. But what we're introducing in this version 2 of checkout is fiat on ramp, meaning that you will no longer need to acquire this native. So the whole like mind bending loops and hoops to get to that token, we'll take care of that for you from just the point of a credit card. And also in this flow, we will seamlessly give you the option to create a non-custodial wallet with just an email. And the seed phrase, which is sort of the key to that wallet, will be fragmented in a decentralized fashion and linked with your email address. So you don't need to remember that seed phrase. So this is where we're going right now, and this is looking extremely exciting for us. There's a huge amount of potential in terms of the space. A lot of people only hear these, like I said before, these layer 1 coins. There's probably 10 that most people know, but if you look in on the layer 2, there's 20, 30, 40, 50,000 projects that have their own token that backs their project, that needs a way to easily sell it to the retail investor, as we call them. So the potential is absolutely mind-bending. If you look at just one decentralized exchange, one project sometimes transacts millions a day. And I'm not kidding. These decentralized exchange, we're talking billions every day that is transacted, from buying and selling. And with us, our business model is pretty straightforward. We have a service fee to enable this transaction, which is 1%. So if you use as an end user checkout on a project's website, you're essentially being charged 1% to not having to have that headache of navigating all those different steps, and it's done, in 3 clicks, and it's done. So this is really exciting. This is our, proof of concept. In terms of where is this going? I mean, for us, we have a clear path. As you've mentioned, Amazon, yes, not for the centralized aspect of it, but the modularity and the complementary aspects of all these different modules to create, this sort of centralized place where you get everything you need. And Stripe, of course, because we transact things. We help facilitate something. And sometimes I like to also, do those parallels with when Stripe came to market. They had to solve a problem that we're currently solving. But the short answer to where I think this is going, in terms of where we stand, there's obviously all the launching of project, which we see just like Kickstarter. For the last 10 to 15 years, crowdfunding was a huge thing. And we think that initial Dex offering, so raising capital in this decentralized fashion, is going to be something big in the next 10 years. So this is where we're positioning ourselves in the trenches, in that massive pipeline of innovation, and providing the tools needed to go. And then I think where we'll go with checkout is the ability to exchange any asset for any asset, um, which could be called like peer-to-peer swaps. And we believe this is going to be like bigger, as big or if not bigger than your current peer-to-peer type of transactions with fiat.
Interesting, yeah. Like I don't know if Napster is the right analogy here. It's like Web one, but yeah, it seems fascinating. I have a few questions. I don't know where I can go here. Like one is like as an entrepreneur, but maybe two, since we're talking about use cases, and you mentioned broader appeal. But I find that everyone today, like the internet, one, everyone's a user. Does there actually need to be a broader appeal for even people like myself, or like even people that are way more outside of tech, to be actually using these tools? Or is it there are enough users where this can be like a self-contained ecosystem that you don't necessarily need monsieur madame tout le monde, as they say, to be using any kind of project? Like, how do you see that in terms of like appeal?
Well, the reality is the space is definitely big enough right now to sustain itself. There's a lot of people making a lot of money in that space, and don't need more people in it. But I think beyond the actual appeal, I think it's the utility of it. And I mean, I don't navigate too much in this non fungible token space. I'm very familiar with it. That's not my core business. But if you think about those NFTs, I think they will become not the collectible part of it, because right now all this art NFT is just one aspect of NFTs, and that's how they got mass, public attention. But if you think of the utility behind it, it's a way to prove ownership. And right now, how do you prove ownership of a lot of things in our sort of day to day life, from something as simple as ticketing? Um, like that whole space will be flipped on his head, in the next couple of years. There will not be any more physical, normal tickets to go see the Habs. It's like not thinkable. It will all be NFTs. If you want to go see a concert, all of those things, events, all NFTs, the whole thing.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up that example. It's like you hear guys like Gary Vaynerchuk talking about like NFTs and receipts, and it's like I'm super skeptical. But again, this is me being like very, I want to say, close minded to a certain extent. But at the same time, it kind of makes sense. It's like proof that you just went to the Festival d'été de Québec. You're one of the 80,000. You saw Rage, and
But
that's
I think beyond that, and apologies for cutting you. It's the whole like royalty and resell ability, the secondary market. Um, you think about scalpers, the authenticity of what they're actually selling. Are you getting scammed? It's all this current infrastructure that is, there's so many faults into it that we just got used to them, that this aspect of the blockchain and this proof of ownership on chain will just change all of that. There will be no more doubt. Artists, when you think of the way singers and songwriters will go to market, it will no longer be, or at least will no longer need to be centralized through these massive labels, and then they'll get 2 or 3% at best at the end. They'll flick the model and be a bottom up type of approach rather than a top to bottom. And what's great is that these early fans that were there in the beginning, and you take just Arcade Fire, They were a local band and they were massive, and then eventually they get to these massive venues, and then you as an original fan, what's the advantage of being one of those true believers in the beginning? There's no advantages to it. But what if you would get you would basically create a community around these NFTs and these accesses of people that have been there in the beginning, and then potentially even beyond that is that if you help the artists start their career and fund it through the purchase of this token, maybe in the smart contract there are these elements of spread or shared royalties as these I don't want to say like this NFT album, when someone buys it, part of the amounts, you get a part of it as a thank you. And so there's so many things you can do, and I think this is truly exciting.
Yeah. Like you said, it's still so early, and the use cases are starting to get there. It's funny you mentioned the band example. It's like even just today, I got an email from Spotify. Hey, a band I'm following, I get like preferential access to some tickets, even though it's not really preferential access. But
Yeah.
it's that concept of being in the exclusive group, which I love, find is fascinating, and you could take that very simplistic idea and apply it in so many different areas. Maybe a personal question, Jason, like your lessons of building. Obviously, multiple time entrepreneur. You've been so in the space for like decade plus. What have you learned with the journey of Embr? Are there any lessons that are, let's say, surprising to you versus, let's say, other startups that you've participated in?
Well, this is the light bulb moment, in the sense that you know I've never seen anything. How can I say? For me, going from an initial idea and to market, I've never been able to fathom the possibility of doing it so fast. And I think this is where a lot of people will see the greatest benefit in this sort of new era, and these new possibilities, um, is is really like, how do you go from this idea to getting a community, and then raising capital, and then going to market? Like, this is almost impossible in web 2. I mean, you see it with the odd cases, serial entrepreneur, calls a friend, gets a seed round, and there you go, it's done. But your average entrepreneur, like, it's so complex. So for me, it was such a validation that this is the future. So this is the light bulb moment for me. This is what I learned. I learned that there are other ways, than your traditional, um, institutional, uh, um, and also, how do you get to market? How do you get your early adopters? I mean, before was, you only had basically Product Hunt, and it was centralized place to launch and get your early adopters. But it's such a unique, space, and I think the responsibility, or at least the beautiful, challenge that I'm giving myself, and that our team is giving themselves, is to make this space more accessible, so that others can experience it and can leverage this sort of Web3 power. But we want to give it a Web2 feel, because it's not because you change the infrastructure that you need to change the experience. The experience doesn't need to change. We just need to change the way, or at least evolve in this, or at least, I mean, there's always going to be the traditional way, but at least if you're interested in doing things differently, then it's out there.
Jason, I can't think of a better place to end, man. This has been a fascinating conversation. I want to thank you for like educating me. Like I find, hey, like someone that actually can explain real use cases for things like NFTs that on the surface may seem like like toys, but have a lot of, like you said, underlying value. My final question, Jason, would be: is people want to learn more, participate in the Embr community? What's the best way?
Well, our URL is Embr. So Embr, by the way, is EMBR. So it's not, there's no E after the B. So embr.org. And if they want to reach out to me, I'm quite responsive both on LinkedIn and on Twitter. Twitter, it's at DeFi_Jason. And yeah, looking
Oh,
forward.
awesome, Jason. Thank you so much, man. This was great.
Awesome. Thanks, Nectar.